Hey everyone, welcome back to all my listeners. This is episode 5 in season 18. Today is Wednesday, July 1st, 2026. My name is Sonal Patel, and this is the Paint the Medical Picture podcast series. All right, you guys. Well, I can't believe it is the start of a brand new month. That's right, we are into the hot, sizzling month of July. I know the heat has been turned way up here in the Chicagoland area. So it's in the mid 90s right now as I'm recording this episode with a heat index of about 110. So it's mighty hot out there. The AC is working overtime. So it is a hot one out there. All right, you guys. Well, let's get into today's episode. It's going to be a short and sweet one and dedicated to one sole, very important subject, and that is the claims form data. And specifically, the claims form is the CMS 1500 claim form. Those are for our professional fee services, primarily our physicians, APPs, but also our laboratories bill on the CMS 1500 claim form. So specifically, I want today's podcast to talk about the very important data on a claim form, which is the date of service. Now, in particular, NGS WellPoint Federal out here in my region, my Medicare administrative contractor, the MAC, has come out with a terrific article just a few days ago that deals directly with labs and lab tests, as well as pathology, specimens, and more. So I really wanted to share with my audience some of this very important detailed information that came out specifically for this region, but it definitely does apply to other MACs. So make sure that you're looking at your own MAC web pages from time to time. Now, their introduction states, quote, "The date of service is a required field on all Medicare claim types. A laboratory service may take place over a period of time. That is, for a given laboratory test, the date the physician orders the test, the date the specimen is collected from the patient, the date the laboratory accesses the specimen, the date of the test, and the date results are produced may occur on different dates." So those couple of sentences right there are very confusing, right? There are several different dates then that a laboratory has to know about, right? There is the date the physician orders the test, the date that the patient is giving a collection either of their blood, their urine, or their tissue, right? So that's the collection date of the specimen. And then when is the laboratory actually accessing that specimen? So is it shipped to them? That's a different date, right? The date of the test performance itself, also very, very different. That could be a couple days later, right? And then finally, there are also those results that are produced, and that will happen after, right, all of the information is analyzed. So lots of confusion over my years when I am auditing for laboratory types of services that are billed out on this CMS 1500 claim form. And that date of service is a key data piece that features largely for this type of service line. Now, the article goes on and talks about, in most cases, the date of service for a laboratory test is the date the specimen was collected, unless certain exceptions are met, as set forth in CFR 414.510B. For instance, if the physician orders the test at least 14 days following a patient's discharge from the hospital, then the date of service is the date the test is performed, instead of the date of the specimen collection. So there's a very important caveat there. Now, CMS has subsequently made several revisions to the date of service rules. Additional exceptions were included in 42 CFR 414.410B5 for our advanced diagnostic tests, our molecular pathology tests, as well as cancer-related protein-based MAAs, when the specimen is collected during an outpatient encounter. So those are for those protein-based assays that are involved when it's cancer related. So there's very specific caveats that are outlined. Now, for these specific tests, the date of service must be the date the test is actually performed when all other conditions are met. Now, NGS and WellPoint Federal go on and say that we recognize that date of service rules can be administratively challenging for laboratories. Like I hinted at, right? There's so much nuance and detail that is involved, and the various dates of service are very, very different, right? Depending on the physician order, the date the specimen is collected, when the test is actually being processed, as well as finally when that report is actually issued. So it's great to see that NGS WellPoint Federal recognizes that administrative challenges actually exist for laboratories. Now, they go on and say that based on frequent inquiries by laboratory providers, NGS believes that there might be uncertainty and confusion about how and when does the 14-day rule apply, when do exceptions to date of service apply, and that date the test is performed is not defined. So there's been lots of confusion and questions that come in to this particular MAC. So the article is trying to outline some of the answers to these multiple questions that the MAC receives. So this article clarifies the MAC's approach to processing claims and offers guidance on appropriate documentation to adhere to the date of service rule. Now the article goes on, date of service for clinical laboratory and pathology specimens. The date of service rules for either a clinical laboratory test or the technical component of a physician pathology service are as follows. So there is a general rule that is about the date of service for clinical diagnostic laboratory tests is the date of the specimen collection unless the physician orders the test at least 14 days following the patient's discharge from the hospital. When the 14-day rule applies, the date of service is the date the test is performed instead of the date of specimen collection. They also go on to talk about the variation. If a specimen is collected over a period that spans 2 calendar days, then the date of service must be the collection date ended. Now, the exceptions there are that the following 3 exceptions apply to the date of service rules for either a clinical laboratory test or the technical component of a physician pathology service. So, an exception is the date of service for tests or services performed on stored specimens. In the case of a test or service performed on a stored specimen, if that specimen was stored for less than or equal to 30 calendar days from the date it was collected, the date of service of the test or service must be the date the test or service was performed, again, only if the test or service is ordered by the patient's physician at least 14 days following the date of the patient's discharge from the hospital. The specimen was collected while the patient was undergoing a hospital surgical procedure. It would be medically inappropriate to have collected the sample other than during the hospital procedure for which the patient was admitted. The results of the test or service do not guide treatment provided during the hospital stay, and if the test or service was reasonable and medically necessary for treatment of an illness. Now, the other exception is for the inpatient encounter. Please document the specimen collection date. If the specimen was processed before storage, notification of place of specimen storage along with the date of specimen was removed from storage is required. And then also for the outpatient encounter, please identify the specimen collection date in the patient's records. If the specimen was processed before storage, notification of place of service of specimen storage along with the date the specimen was removed from storage is required. Now, NGS WellPoint Federal makes a note, for clarification purposes, date test performed is considered the report date. They also have another note, documentation of the above is required in the patient's medical records, such as the pathology or laboratory report for clinical review purposes. So that's a great caveat, right? All of the details that I highlighted above must be documented and they must be retained in the patient's medical records, especially if there is an audit that comes up. Now, the article goes on. If the specimen was stored for more than 30 calendar days before testing, the specimen is considered to have been archived, and the date of service of the test or service must be the date the specimen was obtained from storage. Now, for that inpatient encounter, please document the specimen collection date. If the specimen was processed before storage, documentation of place of service of specimen storage and date specimen was removed from storage is required. Now, if it's for an outpatient encounter, please note the specimen collection date. If the specimen was processed before storage, place of service of specimen storage, documentation of place of service of specimen storage, and date specimen was removed from storage is also required. Now, NGS gives a note. Documentation of the above is required, again, in the patient's medical records, such as the pathology or laboratory report for clinical review purposes. So again, that's a great caveat that has to be included. That's a great reminder that medical records have to include that pathology or laboratory report for any type of audit situation, as well as clinical review purposes. Now, the article moves on and talks about date of service for chemotherapy sensitivity tests and services performed on live tissue. What kind of date of service do we need there? So NGS WellPoint goes into, in the case of a chemotherapy sensitivity test or service performed on live tissue, the date of service of the test or service must be the date the test or service was performed, only if the decision regarding the specific chemotherapeutic agents to test is made at least 14 days after discharge. The specimen was collected while the patient was undergoing a hospital surgical procedure. It would be medically inappropriate to have collected the sample other than during the hospital procedure for which the patient was admitted. The results of the test or service do not guide the treatment provided during the hospital stay, and the test or service was reasonable and medically necessary for treatment of an illness. Now, for purposes of applying all of the above, exception is going to be for a chemotherapy sensitive test is defined as a test that requires a fresh tissue sample to test the sensitivity of tumor cells to various chemotherapeutic agents. CMS identifies such tests through program instructions issued to the MACs. They also have a note in fine print. These tests will be covered only if deemed reasonable and necessary. Now, the article moves on and talks about the date of service for advanced diagnostic laboratory tests and molecular pathology tests. What date of service do they want there? So they talk about in the case of a molecular pathology test performed by a laboratory other than a blood bank or center, or a test designated by CMS as an advanced diagnostic laboratory test under paragraph 1 of the definition of an advanced diagnostic laboratory test in 42 CFR 414.502. The date of service must be the date of the test was performed, only if the test was performed following a hospital outpatient discharge from the hospital outpatient department. The specimen was collected from a hospital outpatient during an encounter, as both are defined in 42 CFR 410.2. It was medically appropriate to have collected the sample from the hospital outpatient during the hospital outpatient encounter. The results of the test do not guide treatment provided during the hospital outpatient encounter, and the test was reasonable and medically necessary for the treatment of an illness. Now, they go on and say a blood bank or center means an entity whose primary function is the performance or responsibility for the performance of the collection, the processing, the testing, the storage, and or distribution of blood or blood components intended for transfusion and transplantation. Now, for the inpatient encounter, the laboratory date of service exception does not apply, so use the date of specimen collection for date of service. For the outpatient encounter, document the date of specimen collection and date test performed. For clarification purposes, date test performed is considered as the report date, as they indicated earlier. Now, for a non-patient encounter, the laboratory date of service exception does not apply, so use the date of specimen collection as the date of service. And they give another note. Documentation of all of the above is required again in the patient's medical records, such as the pathology or the laboratory report for clinical review purposes, as well as in a post-payment audit type situation. Now, there's a helpful decision tree, in my opinion, as well as generous resources and links as well in the article. But one final note that I wanted to share with the audience includes something that I see a lot when I am auditing claims, and this is important. They give a note for under arrangements. Under arrangements, a provider may have others, in this case, laboratories, furnish certain covered items and services to their patients through arrangements under which receipt of payment by the provider for the services discharges the liability of the beneficiary or any other person to pay for the service. In permitting providers to furnish services under arrangements, it was not intended that the provider merely serve as a billing mechanism for the other party. Accordingly, for services provided under arrangements to be covered, the provider must exercise professional responsibility over the arranged for services. When the hospital obtains laboratory tests for outpatients under arrangements with clinical laboratories or other hospital laboratories, only the hospital can bill for the arranged services. All right, you guys. Well, that wraps up today's short and sweet episode. And I really enjoyed discussing all of the details for laboratories, pathology specimens, cancer tests, etc., for our date of service, a very important data element on our CMS 1500 claim form. So we have to be very, very mindful and look to all of the MACs throughout the country, especially if you happen to fall in one of those regions, because I guarantee you there is rich and robust information for how those MACs in those various regions want to apply dates of service. This particular topic today was specific to my region, the NGS Wellpoint Federal region here in the state of Illinois, as well as the various other states that I disclosed last week. So I hope you guys got a lot out of this episode today. All right, you guys. Well, the 4th of July is just around the corner. It is a hot and sizzling month of July so far. I hope you guys have time to cool off, celebrate, have picnics, listen to those fireworks at night, and eat some great watermelon, jump in those pools, and just relax and have a very, very nice long holiday weekend. All right, you guys. Well, I wish you all an amazing and very, very happy week ahead next week. I hope you've got a lot going on. I know I do. All right, you guys. Thank you so much for listening on today's episode. And I hope every week with me brings you closer to helping your providers paint a masterpiece. See you next Wednesday.